Welcome to the new series of encounters here at Sangha Television. Today we welcome you not only to the first edition of the new series of encounters, but to the Wiener Library, the Holocaust Library here in London, and the opening night of an exhibition that remembers the genocide and pogroms of 1984. Welcome. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Okay, joining me now at the Wiener Library is Ben Barco, the director of the library. Ben, welcome to Encounters.
All right, thank you.
Basically, as being the director, could you just give our viewers a brief introduction to the Wiener Library itself, what it represents and its purpose of existence?
Sure. Well, the Wiener Library was founded by a man called Alfred Wiener, hence the name, and he created it in 1933, so immediately after the Nazis came to power in Germany, because he understood that this was an immensely dangerous and threatening thing to the Jewish community in Germany, and he collected all the material he could find out that the Nazis themselves were producing, and then he sort of analysed it and circulated it within Germany and around the world to warn people about what this regime would do. Eventually. Yeah. But he understood it from a very early stage, and in fact in the course of 1933 he fled Germany and he moved the whole collection to Amsterdam and carried on in Amsterdam from 1930, sort of from the late 1933 until the summer of 1939, and then just before the outbreak of the Second World War he moved the whole thing to London.
Alright, so it's, Alfred Wiener basically understood the drip effect of the propaganda and where it would lead.
He understood it extremely well, and he was determined to try to make people think about what they were being told and understand the lie within it. So he did, I think, of course ultimately it failed because the Second World War started and the Holocaust was perpetrated.
Absolutely.
But at least he was a voice inside Germany and then in Amsterdam, trying to make people understand where this was going to go.
Right. With regard to the Wiener Library today, where we stand, and this exhibition in particular, at what point did you realise that Sikhs had gone through a persecution similar in technique and systematic pogrom to what the Jews went through in Germany during Kristallnacht? At what point did you realise its significance, and did you even know that this had happened prior to being?
So I would say about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we at the library took the decision that we would start to collect material and think about other genocides as well as the Holocaust, and that we wanted to bring more and different communities into the library to think about all these issues. And of course, in the case of the Sikh community, the obvious point was this pogrom, and in a sense, it was connected with the time of year when it happened, because in Germany, the November pogrom of 1938 was a turning point in the level of persecution that Jews were subjected to. And the 1984 pogrom happened also at the very beginning of November. So these two things are always together in time, as it were. So next week I'll be teaching a class in a synagogue about the meaning of the 1938 pogrom, and I'll be bringing in material relating to 1984 and this evening and so on. So we're very keen to explore and make connections and help people to think about the wider issues. So because so many things are parallel when these things occur. And if you look at the photographs, these terrible photographs in this exhibition, and you compare them to photographs of the November pogrom in 1938, there are so many similarities. And the propaganda techniques are often quite similar, and we want to make those connections and bring people together to be able to think in broader terms, more global terms about these issues.
Ben, thank you. We appreciate you being part of the show. Thank you. Okay, joining us now at the Wiener Library is Lord Inderjit Singh of Wimbledon.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
So first things first, we're here, we've heard your speech, we're at the Wiener Library. What do you think of this initiative?
I think it's a wonderful initiative. We should focus on this injustice. If we don't speak out for the widows and the suffering people in India, those who lost everything, who will? It's our duty to.
We're getting a lot of people in the mainstream who are saying that we should be moving on. We should be looking towards the future instead of looking back. It's been 30 years now. At what point do we say, we're all holding out for justice, justice denied, justice denied. We're all holding out for justice. It gets more and more difficult to define what justice would mean.
Yeah.
Do you have a definition of what would constitute justice and enable us to move on, enable us to bring closure to the pain we feel?
Yes, I did speak about this at my only meeting in the High Commission since 1984. And I said that it was time for closure and justice, but we need a commission that really looks at issues and points to the guilty. And I don't care if they're the guilty in the Sikh community or guilty in the wider community. We should bring them to justice. That is important. All those we can get hold of. At the same time, the state, India, owes something to the people that they allowed, to the families of the people who were slaughtered in 1984. Now, they must be given compensation. Their education must be taken care of. They are suffering terribly. There's all sorts of problems there. People turn to drugs and so on. Yep. They need every support. And India can't afford to have Hindus and Sikhs at odds with each other. It is time for reconciliation. It is time for justice.
Lord Singh, thank you very much. Okay, joining me now at the Wiener Library is Shona Jolly, international human rights and equalities barrister. And basically, you've spoken earlier regarding the exhibition here and the remembrance of the November '84 pogroms. What do you think? Is it still relevant today, 30 years on? And what do you think of people that expect the Sikh community to move on?
First of all, I have to say that the exhibition has been stunningly curated. Gauri's work is really second to none. And one of the things I found very exceptional about this exhibition is the very tight, strong community that is built, particularly in the artistic community and the journalistic community, that have tried, that you see on the quotes, for example, Hartosh Pal, Rana Dasgupta, Madan Gopal Singh, Nilanjara Roy. There's really strong artistic and journalistic support in India for this movement, and in fact that support has been enhanced by Human Rights Watch today. There's been a big report launched by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. You can't possibly have a modern democracy 30 years on have a complete failure in accountability. It's simply not possible. There's no justice for India's Sikhs, and there's continued uncertainty and division for other ethnic minorities and for the future of communal violence in India. So there has to be accountability, and if anyone says it's time to move on, yes, let's move on, let's have accountability and then allow people to move on.
Thank you, absolutely appreciate that.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Ben Barco. I'm the director of the Wiener Library, and it's my privilege and my pleasure to welcome you to the library for the launch of our exhibition, The 1984 Sikh Pogroms Remembered. An eyewitness to the 1984 attacks wrote, "I realized what Jews must have felt like in Nazi Germany. The killing assumed the proportion of a genocide of the Sikh community. For the first time, I understood what words like pogroms, Holocaust, and genocide really meant." This linking to the Jewish experience was perceptive. By an accident of history, the Sikh pogrom and the 1938 pogrom in Germany both occurred early in November of their respective years, which means that Jews and Sikhs share similar thoughts, feelings and reflections each year at this time. I myself will spend Sunday the 9th of November teaching a synagogue group about the 1938 pogrom, and I'll be bringing the 1984 pogrom into the discussion with them. There is a bond of suffering and sadness that allows the two communities to gain insights into one another. Several years ago, we at the Wiener Library took the decision to extend our work to the wider question of genocide. This has been both rewarding and disturbing. Disturbing when we collide with the vicious and unscrupulous exploitation of genocide and mass murder for political gain, but rewarding on occasions like this, when we are able to forge genuine and meaningful connections between the experiences and sufferings of disparate communities. I want to keep my remarks very brief because we have a lot of people to hear from. But I must pay tribute to my colleague Toby Simpson, the library's Learning and Engagement Manager, who curated the exhibition. He has put together an immensely powerful and thought-provoking piece. During his time with us, Toby has developed great skill as a curator, and we are all fortunate to benefit from the work of this gifted man. Both Toby and I want to express our gratitude to the photographers, Gauri Gill, Ashok Vahi, Ram Raman and Sandeep Shankar, whose work is displayed, and to other contributors to the project, Arpana Kaur, Harvinder Singh Pulka, Dr. Nav Sharan Singh, Dr. Uma Chakravarti, Jaspreet Singh and Parvinder Singh. And with that, I'll keep it brief. I'll hand over to Toby and he can introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Ben. It's lovely words, but it really does give me far too much credit. I think the greatest credit for this exhibition has to go to the people who created the photographs, which are extraordinarily powerful, and putting work like this and realising it onto the wall is really nothing in comparison to the work that has gone into making them. A huge number of people have contributed to this, authors, writers, and so really my work was principally logistical on this project, but it's nevertheless been a massive privilege to work with such a group of talented individuals, and I'm going to introduce one of them as the first speaker. The way we're going to do this is we're going to have 3 short speeches, and then at the end we'll have a chance for you, the audience, to ask some questions, and I'll chair that session. And the first of our speakers, as I said, is someone who I've worked with very closely on this exhibition, Parvinder Singh, who works in publishing, formerly with Bloomsbury Publishing, and he's a member of the Magazine and Books Industrial Council of the National Union of Journalists. He's been campaigning through the National Union of Journalists on the issue of the 1984 pogroms, and he placed a motion at this year's NUJ conference about this very exhibition to provide a place where people can remember, where people can reflect on and discuss this very, very important historical event as it meets its 30th anniversary. So please, I'd like to introduce and invite to the stage Parvinder Singh, if you could join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Toby. As Toby explained, this exhibition came about after a resolution at the National Union of Journalists conference early on this year to provide space in a public space for remembrance of the 84 pogroms, space for reflection and space for discussion. And therefore we are very grateful to the Wiener Library to provide that space and to feature the work of Gauri Gill. Jis tan lage soi jane, only she whose body's hurt knows. And these images that you see are from Gauri Gill's 1984 notebooks, reflecting upon the pogroms and their ongoing impact in India. "30 years ago, on the 31st of October, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was shot dead by her 2 Sikh bodyguards in revenge to the attack 4 months earlier on the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, which resulted, according to former Supreme Judge V.M. Tarkundi, resulted in a massacre of mostly pilgrims. On the day of the 31st of October, although sporadic violence did take place on the day, the death of the Prime Minister didn't lead people to start burning people. The cue was given by Arun Nehru MP, close confidant and cousin of the new Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, to start the killings of Sikhs by public burnings. We know this because a former civil servant recently made this public in India. In the evening, Sikh houses were marked with the letter S. Following morning, on the 1st of November, local Congress leaders from all 4 corners of Delhi and other Congress-led states met and incited mobs to kill Sikhs. The method was chillingly similar. Sikh neighbourhoods would be sealed off by the police. Local Gurdwara or Sikh temple would be attacked and burnt, including the Sikh holy book. Death squads were dispatched with voter lists to ensure every Sikh on their lists were killed in a meticulous manner. Phosphorus white powder was used to ensure the flesh burnt quickly. The women were kidnapped to outlying villages and gang raped. This wasn't just an affair in Delhi. Sikhs were killed in all Congress-led states in India. Massacres took place in Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh, Bokaro in Bihar. Sikh villages such as Hund, Chillad, Pataudi in Haryana were wiped out. In Madhya Pradesh, the violence spread to nearly 40 towns. Similar attacks occurred in Himachal, Assam, West Bengal, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. Yes, hundreds of Hindus and Muslims saved many of their Sikh neighbours in their houses at great risk to their lives. Hundreds, but thousands just watched. While I was helping out on this exhibition last week, I met an elderly Jewish man. And like Ben said, there's comparisons with the Kristallnacht, 1938, the anti-Jewish pogroms. Now he was lucky he came on the Kinder transport to the UK just before the war. But he was telling me that on the day of Kristallnacht, his father was taken by the Gestapo and shot. In another November 1938, again this was triggered by an assassination, this time of a German diplomat by a Jew. The German government at the time portrayed the violence as, I quote, riots and a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, when it was clearly organised by Hitler's Nazi thugs. The 1984 pogroms were also labelled as riots, a term in which the state actors and perpetrators have managed to hide behind for so long. They have deliberately minimised the enormity and brutality of the genocidal pogroms that took place and their organised nature. Three decades later, numerous whitewash commissions, not a single prominent politician, cabinet minister, bureaucrat, judge, or high-ranking police officer has been brought to justice. In fact, the organisers were rewarded with cabinet posts and the police with gallantry medals. One of the perpetrators, Kamal Nath, is the current pro tem Speaker of the Indian Parliament and is set to become the leader of the opposition. No full and independent inquiry was ever conducted. No memorials exist to the dead. I'm going to finish with the words of a Delhi-based filmmaker, Zarina Muhammad, who is quoted in Gauri Gill's 1984 notebook, which we released today. We are responsible for those who survived. Their cause is our own, as are their terrors. Generations died, generations within a family. Children lost their parents. Entire families were wiped out forever. In civilized nations, this is called genocide, crime against humanity, ethnic cleansing. In India, it's called, quote, the aftermath of the Sikh riots. What proof does anyone need that India is still a society in denial at best and a vengeful one at worst? We will never forget. The victims stand beside us as a family, gathered under our shelters. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Powerful words. So I'd like to come to introduce our second speaker, Shona Jolly. Shona Jolly is a writer, journalist and barrister specialising in human rights and equality law. She's from London but has lived and worked in a number of countries, including India. She's particularly focused in her work on South Asian affairs and writes for a number of international publications. And she's also executive committee member of the Bar Human Rights Committee. So with that, I'd like to invite Shona Jolly to speak to us.
It's difficult to know where to begin this evening. I have so much that I want to be able to say. There's so much to say on the legal side, there's so much to say on the political side. But what I'm going to focus on today, and knowing that Lord Singh is speaking after me on where we are now politically, internationally, I want to speak to you today about the distortion of language, about the silence that has surrounded 1984, and about the way in which that silence and that insidious use of language has facilitated, has aided and has abetted the complete failures of accountability that we all know have taken place, or the failures in justice that have taken place in India today. And the impunity that the perpetrators continue to enjoy is partly made easy for them by this feeling that which now exists in India. Why can't we just move on? Congress have expressed it. Sonia Gandhi has expressed it. Why can't we just move on? I was asked here today by somebody, what do you say to people who say, why can't we just move on? And my answer to that is, yes, let's move on. But let's have accountability and allow the victims of this injustice to move on before we think it's something that happened in the past. Everyone in this room is no doubt familiar with the very chilling phrase that Rajiv Gandhi used shortly after his mother's, in respect of his mother's assassination. When a big tree falls, it's only natural that the earth around it shakes a little. Those words began the twisting of language that would build up and create a social myth in India and beyond that the violence that took place between the 31st of October and the 5th of November was an involuntary, spontaneous outpouring of grief and anguish in response to the murder of a very loved Prime Minister. The difference is that murder convictions were quickly meted out to the two assassins, but as Pravinder has already said, there have been no significant convictions of anybody that ought to have been convicted for their involvement, for their architecture, for their organisation, and for their execution of these massacres, these pogroms, in a really grand scale. What India has done is perfected the British art of throwing a story to the wind by creating a commission of inquiry, and there have been 10 of those. And the two that I particularly want to talk about are the Mishra and the Nanavati commissions, who I think have used language in such a way, in such a twisting way, and frankly, in a way that could never be described as careless, because these are judges. The latter, Nanavati, was a Supreme Court judge at the time. The former, Mishra, was promoted to become a Supreme Court judge. Their use of language, and particularly their use of legal language, or their failures to use legal language, is part of the reason, I think, that there has been a permission, if you like, for silence in society. There's been a reaction from society that says, well, the commissions have done their work now, we can all move on. But what Nanavati actually found, the evidence that he actually got, the testimony that he received, led him, as it had in part Mishra, to conclude actually that whatever may have taken place spontaneously on the 31st of October, the day that the Prime Minister was assassinated, what happened at least from the morning of the 1st of November 1984 was not spontaneous. And I just want to take a bit of your time to read a part of the conclusion that Nanavati in 2005 reached. He said, "There is evidence to show that at some places the mobs indulging in violent attacks had come in Delhi Transport Corporation buses or vehicles. They either came armed with weapons and inflammable materials like kerosene, petrol, and some white powder, or they were supplied with such materials soon after they were taken to the localities where the Sikhs were to be attacked. There is also evidence on record to show that on the 31st of October, either meetings were held or the persons who could organise attacks were contacted and were given instructions to kill Sikhs and loot their houses and shops. The attacks were made in a systematic manner and without much fear of the police, almost suggesting that they were assured that they would not be harmed whilst committing those acts and even hereafter. Male members of the Sikh community were taken out of their houses. They were beaten first and then burnt alive in a systematic manner. In some cases, tyres were put around their necks and then they were set on fire by pouring kerosene or petrol over them. In some cases, white inflammable powder was thrown on them, which immediately caught fire thereafter. This was a common pattern which was followed by the big mobs which played havoc in certain areas. The shops were identified, looted, and then burnt. Thus, what had initially started as an angry outburst became an organised carnage. That doesn't sound to me like a spontaneous riot. That isn't a finding that there was a spontaneous riot. But Nanavati continued himself throughout the duration of his report to refer to what happened in those 5 days as the 1984 riots. That cannot be excused as loose language. He was a Supreme Court judge at the time. He knew the importance of technical legal language. He ought to have known what the 1948 Genocide Convention said itself. India has ratified that convention, even if it's done so with a reservation. He ought to have known, at the very least, what the Indian Penal Code said. There is a right in international law, and indeed under Indian law, to an effective investigation, to an effective remedy. Very recently there's been a brilliant article which I highly commend to you all called The Sins of Commission by a great Indian journalist called Hartosh Singh Bal. And that was, I think, Pravinder's reference to Arun Nehru, who has, there is indirect evidence that links him now to the orchestration of these attacks. And had Nanavati or Mishra or any of the other 8 committees or commissions before them actually asked the right questions, they would have got proper answers. And one has to question why Supreme Court judges, advocates in their time before that, weren't able to ask the right questions and then to use the right language. And I suggest they didn't ask the right questions because they didn't want to have to use the language that would force them into a definition, be it of complicity, be it of murder, be it of genocidal pogroms. I'm just going to ask a few of those right now. Who organised the meetings on the 31st of October? Who permitted and organised the use of official Delhi transport buses? Who provided and distributed the use of government voter lists in order to identify Sikh homes and businesses? Were there local Gurdwara lists distributed that were registered to identify Sikh residents in particular? Again, this is something that Hartosh Singh Bal has uncovered recently. It's long been suspected, but there now appears to be proof. Who provided, distributed, and devised the strategy that led to the necklacing, a term that was used in South African apartheid, of Sikh men? Where did this white inflammable powder come from? Why weren't these questions answered? Why weren't they actually even asked? And there's another question which is silent generally from this debate. What of the women? Why has there been silence surrounding the mass rape of women in 1984? It was used as a tool of terror. The list just goes on. I could go on for a long time, and I know I've got to stop. But I just want to say that I just want to tell you what the definition of genocide is according to the Geneva Convention. And I want to say that it's taken me a long time to use the word genocide. In all the years that I've been writing about this topic, I consider that genocide is a loaded political word. I have asked, will it help to use that word in this context? Will it get accountability? The American government, for example, recognises that what happened in 1984 was one of the darkest days in India's history, but it can't recognise that it's a genocide. And so the question is, does it make it more complicated? Look at what happened in Rwanda. Does it make it more complicated to use the word genocide? But the conclusion I have finally reached, as we've hit 3 decades on since the pogroms, the attacks, the violence, is that what has partly contributed to these mass failures in accountability is the looseness of language that has been deployed, is the fact that people have been allowed to get away with not calling a spade a spade. This is the definition of genocide according to, or this is part of the definition of genocide according to the Geneva Conventions. Killing members of an ethnic or religious group or causing serious bodily or mental harm, which includes rape and mass sexual violence, to members of that group with intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. And note that an individual criminal may be guilty of genocide even if he kills only one person, so long as he knew he was participating in a larger plan to destroy the group. Nanavati had evidence before him that would have enabled him to draw those conclusions, if not in accordance with the Genocide Convention, then in accordance with the Indian Penal Code. And so I finish by going back to Rajiv Gandhi's words. And I say that if the language that surrounds 1984 doesn't change, then India herself cannot change. When that big tree fell, someone chose to shake the earth. Someone chose to bring buses in, to bring in mobs, to trample on that earth, and then to douse it with kerosene, inflammable powder, and blood. Someone chose not to call in the army to maintain law and order. Someone then chose not to investigate it again and again and again. Are we still calling it a riot now?
Thank you. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Lord Inderjit Singh, Director of the Network of Sikh Organisations UK. He's also, Lord Singh, sorry, I've got a few more words to say about you. He's also Vice Chair and Founder of the Interfaith Network UK, Head and Coordinator of Sikh Chaplaincy Services, and a member of the House of Lords. He's the editor of Sikh Messenger and has been presenter of Thought for the Day on BBC Radio 4 and BBC Radio 2's Pause for Thought. So please join me in welcoming Lord Inderjit Singh.
First of all, I'd like to show my gratitude to the Wiener Library and to all who made this exhibition possible, and particularly to my friend Parvinder Singh, who's been campaigning for a long time in this direction, and he wrote, and I helped him with the book Sikh Kristallnacht, and the network of Sikh organisations also helped in that direction. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've heard 2 very moving accounts that take us back to 1984 and the horrors inflicted on the Sikh community, planned horrors. There was certainly no riot. It was a planned massacre. It was genocide. We've heard those accounts, and now we are 30 years on, and as people say, why not move on? And that is the common phrase used in India, particularly. Why not move on? Well, yes, we do want to move on, but with justice and proper closure. Now, This time last year, almost on this very day last year, I was invited to the Indian High Commission to speak on the anniversary of Guru Nanak's birth. Now, I've kept away from the Indian High Commission ever since 1984. I was very prominent at the time in raising issues, raising the hurt of Sikhs in this country. At one time, I was at the top of a High Commission blacklist for people who could not go to India. And it was removed very much later. Now, but even in 1998 when I went, I had great trouble. And it was the BBC. I went with the BBC to make some programs on the 300th anniversary of Asaki. And even then I had programs when the BBC insisted that I go because these programs are important. Now, we have moved on, but I was thinking, shall I accept this invitation or not? And I could see the changing situation in India. It looked as if the Congress party were going to lose the election. And there seemed to be an opportunity in the 30th year of actually moving forward to bring closure to still grieving families. And so I took the opportunity, I accepted the invitation, I went to the High Commission, and I saw a number of quite hostile faces, but I spoke about Guru Nanak and the message of Guru Nanak of promoting goodwill and understanding between different religious communities. And I mentioned that at one time Sikhs and Hindus used to be very, very close. So much so that in many Hindu families, the parents would bring up the eldest child as a Sikh. That was the closeness. And now there is nothing but distrust, bitterness and distrust. And I said that here is an excellent opportunity to move the way Guru Nanak wanted us to move and to bring closure. And there must be some Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look at what happened and to go further than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa to actually pin the guilty, to punish the guilty. And I said, Congress says it was Sikh extremists, okay? Let's find out. Blame the guilty and punish the guilty on any side, on either side. Now, I saw some frowns in the audience, and then, to my surprise, the acting High Commissioner said, I agree with every word you've said. We must move in that direction. We haven't got too far, but I don't think we should stop trying. Thank you.
Okay, we're still here at the Wiener Library, looking around at the exhibition, bumping into people who have also come to view the exhibition here on the opening night of this remembrance for 1984. With me now is Sunny Hundal, journalist and blogger. Would it be fair to say? Yep, journalist and blogger. And just get his views on what he thinks of the exhibition and his views regarding the remembrance of 1984, whether it is time to move on.
Thanks for having me on. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think the exhibition is fantastic and it's really important, as the panel said. And I think what's significant is that, you know, a Jewish organization is hosting it because we do want to make it interfaith. We want to make it about human rights. And I think also what was interesting, and I agree with the panel, was that you know, there is more and more, I think, demand for a look at what happened in 94. So rather than thinking that the voices are going to die down, there is an increased interest specifically on 1984, I think, treating it as a human rights issue and then trying to find out what happened.
You yourself, do you feel that it's time to move on, or do you feel it's time to entrench yourself, so to speak, and actually demand justice? And if you do demand justice, what would constitute justice for you?
I think it is always important to keep on demanding justice. Even in this case, there are lots of survivors still out there. There's lots of people who are still feeling the impact and the aftermath of what happened. But I think it's important to focus on 1984 as a specific issue rather than getting sidetracked into an issue about Hindus versus Sikhs, or getting into sidetracked into an issue about Khalistan, because those are political issues and that's a separate debate. And to me, 1984 has always been a human rights issue, and I think that even 30 years on, it's still important to talk about it as a human rights issue and having justice about that. And I fully support that cause, and I fully agree that there should be a UN-led commission to look at what happened then and try and have reparations and try and offer support to people that were affected, and also justice.
What would constitute justice? Would politicians, policemen be in prison? Would that be justice, or reparations, like you said yourself, financial reparations to the survivors' families? What would constitute justice and enable us as a community to experience closure, to then move forward?
It's difficult to say because obviously different people have different views. I would personally think that an element of helping the survivors would be really important. And I also think that acknowledging, at least in India, acknowledging that actually politicians did play a part, that it was specifically a driven pogrom where, there was orders from the top to say that we're going to target Sikhs and that we're going to find them in their houses, the lists of people, and that I think is important because there's never been acknowledgement and there's never been much support for the victims. I think those two things, if we were to deal with that satisfactorily, I think that would make a huge impact, and I think that for the vast majority of Sikhs, that would probably go a long way in dealing with the aftermath.
Beginning to heal wounds.
With the healing process, yeah.
Sonny, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, this has been the new series of encounters, beginning here today at the Wiener Library at the opening of the Remembrance exhibition for November 1984, the pogroms and genocide that took place there. Join us again next week, same time, for more encounters. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.